4 grocery bags now cost $200, and no one flinches anymore. A $30 errand quietly turns into 34, then 40, then a breakdown in the parking lot. People with good jobs live in trailers. Families sleep in cars. 2 full-time workers hunt second jobs just to stay afloat. Rent only moves one direction. Health insurance explodes overnight. And every month, the paycheck gets thinner while the bills get louder. They keep saying the economy is strong, but America feels exhausted. This isn't a crash. It's a slow, grinding squeeze. And millions are starting to let go. What you are about to see never shows up in press conferences or polished economic reports because it can't be controlled. This layer of the economy doesn't live in quarterly earnings or stock indexes. It lives in receipts, bills, pay stubs, and bank balances that hit 0 days before the month ends. This is the part of the system that leaks reality. When officials say inflation is cooling, they're talking about percentages. When people talk online, they're talking about dollars. And dollars are what actually decide whether a life works or collapses. The mainstream narrative relies on averages. Averages hide pain. An average grocery bill doesn't show that a basic cart now regularly crosses $200, or that everyday household items quietly cost 30 to 60% more than they did a few years ago. An average rent number doesn't show that millions of leases reset higher every 12 months with no ceiling and no negotiation. An average wage doesn't show that paychecks have barely moved while core expenses, food, shelter, insurance, transportation, have risen faster than incomes for years. The math looks stable from far away. Up close, it's breaking. This is why official data keeps colliding with lived experience. GDP can grow while households shrink. Job numbers can look strong while multiple incomes are required to maintain a single life. Markets can rally while consumer savings rates sink and credit balances rise. None of that is a contradiction. It's a divergence. The system measures productivity and output. People feel affordability and survival. Those are no longer the same thing. Look at the pressure points. Housing absorbs 30 to 50% of take-home pay for millions. Healthcare premiums jump by hundreds of dollars overnight. Auto prices hover near $50,000 for new vehicles, while insurance and interest costs stack on top. Even average earners near $66,000 face annual expenses approaching $80,000 before emergencies, before repairs, before life happens. That gap doesn't close with budgeting, it closes with debt. And debt is now filling every crack. Credit cards, buy now, pay later plans, payment schedules for necessities, not luxuries, necessities. When food, rent, and insurance are financed, the economy hasn't adapted. It has failed quietly. This is why consumer behavior is changing. People aren't spending less because they're disciplined. They're spending less because they're depleted. This layer matters because it explains everything that comes next. When enough households hit the same wall at the same time, consumption slows, credit stress rises, and confidence collapses. Not suddenly, gradually, invisibly, then all at once. The testimonies you're hearing aren't noise, they're signals. And once enough signals align, the surface narrative can no longer hold. When the gap between official numbers and lived reality becomes impossible to ignore, it reveals itself first in food. Not because groceries are symbolic, but because they are unavoidable. Housing can be delayed, purchases can be postponed, subscriptions can be canceled, eating cannot. That is why rising food costs are the clearest signal that the system is no longer working for the people inside it. What makes this moment different is not just that prices are higher, it's how fast and how unevenly they've moved. Core grocery categories have surged 30% to 45% in just a few years. Eggs that once cost $1.50 now regularly sit near $4. Ground beef that hovered around $3 per pound pushes past $6. Chicken breasts that were $2 are often $5. A gallon of milk inches toward $5 in many regions. These aren't luxury items, these are the base of every household diet. At the same time, wages for most workers rose only 3 to 4% annually, leaving families forced to absorb the difference week after week. This is where budgeting fails. Switching brands no longer lowers the bill because store brands climbed alongside name brands. Buying in bulk requires upfront cash many households no longer have. Shopping sales means buying less, not saving more, because discounts now come off inflated starting prices. Shrinkflation quietly reduced package sizes while prices stayed elevated, turning smart shopping into an illusion. The strategies that once softened inflation no longer exist. Food pressure also hits more often than any other expense. Rent shows up monthly. Insurance shows up quarterly. Groceries hit 4 to 8 times every month. That frequency wears people down. Each trip reinforces the same message. The money doesn't stretch anymore. Over time, this doesn't cause panic. It creates exhaustion. People stop reacting. They just accept less. That acceptance is visible in how food is paid for. A growing share of Americans now rely on credit or installment plans to buy groceries. Roughly 1/4 of households use buy now, pay later services for food purchases. That shift matters. Financing necessities means households are no longer managing cash flow. They are managing survival. Once food moves onto payment plans, financial stability becomes fragile by default. The consequences ripple outward. Higher grocery bills shrink what's left for rent, transportation, utilities, and insurance. Small shortfalls become recurring deficits. Those deficits accumulate into debt. And debt quietly reshapes behavior. Fewer purchases, delayed care, skipped repairs, constant trade-offs. Food inflation does not stay in the kitchen. It rewrites the entire household balance sheet, one receipt at a time. When food consumes more of a paycheck, housing becomes the next pressure point. Not because rent suddenly rose in isolation, but because there is no longer any buffer left to absorb it. Groceries drain flexibility, housing eliminates it. This is where affordability stops being a challenge and starts becoming a constraint that reshapes where and how people are allowed to live. Rents did not just rise, they reset higher and stayed there. Nationally, average rents climbed more than 20 to 25% in just a few years, but averages again hide the damage. In many metro areas, one-bedroom apartments now demand $1,700 to $2,300 a month. That single number matters because it collides directly with income reality. For millions of households, rent alone now consumes 40 to 55% of take-home pay, far beyond what any budget can sustainably handle. When housing crosses that threshold, everything else becomes optional, including stability. What traps people is not just price, but structure. Most leases renew annually, and each renewal carries a one-way adjustment. Downward resets are rare. Moving doesn't solve the problem because nearby options follow the same pricing curve. Downsizing doesn't help because smaller units have risen faster than larger ones. Waiting doesn't work because wages don't catch up while rents compound. This is the beige box trap. Identical apartments, identical pricing, identical terms, with no escape route inside the system. As flexibility disappears, housing choices narrow into survival decisions. That's where the shift becomes visible. More people double up, more people delay independence, more people rotate through short-term arrangements. And for a growing number, housing is no longer a fixed address at all. Vehicles, temporary stays, and improvised living arrangements are not lifestyle experiments. They are responses to math that no longer balances. When rent competes directly with food, insurance, and transportation, permanence becomes a luxury. The data confirms the behavior. Eviction filings remain elevated. Household mobility rises for the wrong reasons. Overcrowding increases even as unit sizes shrink. Meanwhile, new construction targets higher income renters, leaving the lower half of the market starved of supply. This imbalance locks prices in place. Housing doesn't become cheaper when demand is forced, and it becomes scarcer. And scarcity changes psychology. Once housing feels unstable, people stop planning long-term. They delay families, they delay healthcare, they avoid career risks. They cling to any income source that preserves shelter, even if it erodes everything else. At that point, housing is no longer a place to live. It's a condition that dictates behavior. This is how rising food costs quietly feed into housing instability without repeating the same shock. One drains cash weekly, the other captures what's left monthly. Together, they compress choices until work itself must multiply just to preserve the same square footage. Once housing stops being affordable, the promise attached to work is put on trial. For decades, a good job was supposed to solve everything upstream: rent, food, stability, savings. That promise is now broken, not because people stopped working, but because income no longer scales with the cost of staying alive. The collapse doesn't begin at the bottom of the wage ladder. It begins in the middle, where expectations and reality collide. On paper, the numbers still look respectable. The average salary in the United States sits near $66,000. That figure is constantly cited as proof that households should be fine, but expenses tell a different story. Average annual living costs now approach $78,000 to $80,000 before emergencies, before childcare, before medical surprises. That gap isn't a rounding error, it's structural. And it means a household can do everything right and still fall behind. This is why the advice people keep hearing feels insulting. Skip coffee, cancel subscriptions, cook at home. Those tactics once mattered at the margin. They no longer close a multi-thousand-dollar annual deficit. When rent absorbs over $20,000 a year, insurance eats another $6,000 to $10,000, transportation pushes past $9,000, and groceries approach $10,000, there's nothing left to optimize. The problem is not behavior, it is arithmetic. What makes this collapse uniquely destabilizing is that it hits people who followed the rules. Degrees, certifications, years of experience, full-time schedules. These were supposed to unlock comfort. Instead, they now barely secure survival. Inflation rose faster than wages for years, compounding quietly while pay increases stalled in the 3 to 4% range. Over time, purchasing power eroded so gradually that many didn't notice until the finish line disappeared. This erosion also changes how work feels. A job that once built a future now only maintains the present. Raises don't create relief, they get absorbed instantly by rent resets, insurance hikes, and tax drag. Even promotions fail to move the needle. When higher income simply triggers higher costs, ambition turns into frustration. That's when the emotional contract between workers and the economy breaks. The data supports the shift. Savings rates have fallen. Credit balances have climbed. More households report living paycheck to paycheck despite stable employment. This is not laziness or mismanagement. It's the result of a system where wages lag the very expenses they're meant to cover. Middle-class security was never guaranteed by income alone. It depended on costs staying within reach. That condition no longer holds. This is why housing pressure doesn't just force relocation, it forces work to change shape. When a single job can't carry fixed expenses, labor must multiply. Side work, overtime, secondary income streams, not for advancement, but for survival. The myth of the good job collapses precisely when the economy demands more labor than one life can sustainably give. When a single income stops covering fixed costs, labor doesn't fail and it fragments. What replaces the promise of stable work is not unemployment, but multiplication. One job becomes two. Two incomes become four streams, not to advance, not to invest, but simply to hold the same ground month after month. This is the point where work stops paying and starts replicating. The math explains why. Fixed expenses no longer flex. Rent, insurance, utilities, transportation, and food arrive on schedule and rise without permission. Once those obligations consume most of take-home pay, any disruption, a bill increase, a missed hour, a repair, creates an immediate shortfall. The system does not absorb shocks anymore. Households are forced to absorb them with additional labor. This is why the modern workweek quietly expanded without legislation or headlines. 40 hours became the baseline just to exist. Overtime, gig work, contract labor, and weekend shifts are no longer optional extras. They are structural requirements. The rise of side income is often framed as entrepreneurial freedom, but the numbers tell a different story. A growing share of households now rely on multiple income sources just to stay current on bills totaling $4,000 to $6,000 per month in ordinary expenses. What makes this shift dangerous is how it hides inside productivity. Employment can look strong while exhaustion spreads. Job participation can remain high while financial security collapses. People are working more hours than before, yet household net worth stagnates. Output increases, stability does not. This disconnect allows the system to claim success while individuals experience burnout. As work multiplies, time disappears. Additional income is purchased with evenings, weekends, rest, and health. That trade-off carries long-term costs. Stress-related illness rises. Family time erodes. Skill development stalls because survival work crowds out advancement. Labor becomes reactive instead of strategic. The economy may gain hours, but it loses resilience. There is also a ceiling to this model. You cannot infinitely add jobs to a finite body. Each additional income stream delivers diminishing returns once taxes, transportation, childcare, and recovery time are accounted for. At that point, effort increases while net benefit flattens. People are not refusing to work harder. They are hitting human limits. This multiplication also reshapes behavior across the economy. Spending tightens. Risk tolerance drops. Workers cling to any arrangement that preserves cash flow, even if it offers no growth. Consumption slows not because of choice, but because energy is redirected toward endurance. When work becomes about maintaining balance instead of building momentum, the entire system shifts from expansion to survival mode. And as labor stretches thinner to cover basic costs, one category of expense becomes impossible to outrun with extra hours alone: health. That is where multiplication meets a wall, and where financial pressure turns into existential risk. Once labor multiplies just to hold the same ground, healthcare becomes the expense that cannot be outrun. Extra hours can cover rent. Side income can soften food costs. But no amount of hustle protects against a single letter in the mail that rewrites the math overnight. This is where financial pressure stops being gradual and turns into a cliff. Healthcare costs don't rise smoothly, they jump. Premiums reset. Subsidies expire. Deductibles reset to zero. What looked manageable one month becomes catastrophic the next. Monthly premiums of $300 to $400 can suddenly surge past $800, with projections climbing toward $1,200 to $1,300 a month. That is before a single doctor visit, before prescriptions, before testing. For households already stretched thin, this isn't a bill, it's a trigger. What makes this system uniquely destructive is that it demands payment without providing protection. Many plans now pair high premiums, with deductibles exceeding $6,000 to $9,000 per year. That means families pay thousands simply for the right to pay more later. Coverage exists on paper. Risk remains fully personal. One illness, one accident, one diagnosis converts financial stress into immediate instability. This pressure compounds existing strain rather than replacing it. Housing already consumes a dominant share of income. Work has already multiplied to compensate. Healthcare doesn't arrive as a separate problem. It stacks on top of everything else. And unlike other expenses, it cannot be delayed without consequences. Skip a purchase and nothing happens. Skip care, and the cost returns larger, harsher, and more urgent. Age intensifies the danger. Workers not yet eligible for Medicare face the highest premiums and the least flexibility. Income thresholds can eliminate subsidies abruptly, even as wages fail to keep pace with living costs. This creates a paradox where earning slightly more can result in being significantly worse off. The system penalizes proximity to stability. The macro numbers confirm the squeeze. Employer-sponsored insurance premiums have risen over 20% in recent years. Out-of-pocket maximums continue climbing. Medical debt remains one of the leading causes of bankruptcy in the United States, even among insured households. This is not a fringe outcome. It is a common endpoint in an economy where healthcare functions as a financial accelerant. The behavioral effects are immediate. Preventive care is delayed. Prescriptions are rationed. Emergency rooms become the default provider because they cannot refuse service. Costs shift downstream, returning later with interest. What begins as an insurance issue transforms into long-term economic drag, reducing workforce participation and increasing dependency. This is where the illusion of control finally breaks. Budgeting fails, extra work fails, planning fails. Healthcare exposes the limits of individual responsibility in a system that prices survival beyond reach. And once people realize that one medical event can erase years of effort, confidence collapses. From that point forward, every financial decision becomes defensive, not about progress, but about avoiding disaster. When healthcare turns from protection into risk, debt stops being a backup and becomes the operating system. This is how financial strain reorganizes itself across the economy, not through one dramatic collapse, but through a chain reaction where obligations are pushed forward, split into payments, and quietly normalized. Debt doesn't appear all at once, it spreads. The first shift is subtle. Credit stops funding discretionary spending and starts funding necessities. Groceries, utilities, transportation, prescriptions, expenses that were once paid in full are now staggered. Buy now, pay later plans, originally designed for retail convenience, have moved into survival territory. Roughly 1 in 4 Americans now use installment plans to buy food. That single statistic matters more than any consumer sentiment survey. It signals that cash flow has failed at the most basic level. Once essentials move onto payment plans, the hierarchy of debt flips. Credit cards carry balances longer. Minimum payments replace payoff plans. Interest compounds quietly while incomes remain flat. Household debt grows not because people are reckless, but because timing no longer works. Bills arrive faster than money does. Financing becomes the bridge between weeks, not months. This restructuring bleeds directly into consumption patterns. Retail spending may spike during promotional periods, but the composition has changed. Reports showing that the vast majority of holiday purchases are financed reflect this distortion. Sales are no longer driven by confidence. They're driven by deferred payment. Demand appears healthy on the surface while the underlying ability to pay erodes. That divergence is not sustainable. The consequences reach beyond households. Credit issuers depend on repayment velocity. When more purchases are financed and fewer balances are cleared, defaults rise and recovery rates fall. Lenders tighten standards. Interest rates climb, fees expand. The cost of borrowing increases precisely when borrowers are most vulnerable. The food chain feeds on itself. Meanwhile, quality deteriorates as prices rise. Corporations protect margins by shrinking products, cutting durability, and lowering service levels. Consumers notice. The psychological response is not panic, it's disengagement. Spending slows not because people suddenly became disciplined, but because the value exchange feels broken. When prices rise faster than quality, demand doesn't disappear instantly, it decays. This decay explains the contradiction between strong corporate earnings and weak household balance sheets. Companies can post profits while consumers hollow out as long as credit fills the gap. But credit has limits. Once repayment capacity is strained across enough households, demand no longer rebounds after promotions. It stalls. Debt also changes how people think about the future. Long-term planning gives way to short-term triage. Purchases are evaluated not by value, but by whether they can be split into 4 payments. Financial decisions become fragmented. The economy becomes reactive. At that point, debt is no longer a tool, it's a dependency. And an economy built on dependency doesn't collapse suddenly. It slows, stiffens, and eventually stops responding to incentives. When even basic consumption relies on borrowed time, the signal is clear: the system is running on fumes, not growth. Once debt becomes the fuel for everyday life, behavior changes before statistics do. This is the final shift. Not panic, not protest, but surrender. People stop expecting improvement. They stop believing effort will be rewarded. The economy doesn't collapse loudly here, it goes quiet. And that silence is the most dangerous signal of all. Surrender begins when the mental math no longer works, when budgeting doesn't create relief, when extra work doesn't move the needle, when planning feels pointless because every gain is erased by the next bill. This is the phase where people stop asking how to get ahead and start asking how to endure. That change alone reshapes everything: spending, work, family formation, health, and trust. You can see it in the numbers. Savings rates hover near historic lows. Emergency funds vanish. Credit utilization stays elevated even as interest rates remain punishing. A growing share of households report that a $400 emergency would require borrowing or selling something. That is not fragility at the margins, as that is systemic exposure. It means millions are one shock away from collapse with no buffer left. This is also where institutions quietly adapt to failure. Schools fund parking solutions for unhoused families. Employers normalize burnout. Governments adjust eligibility thresholds instead of reducing costs. Assistance becomes harder to access while living expenses climb. The system doesn't fix the pressure, it manages the fallout. That management creates the illusion of stability while normalizing decline. The labor market reflects this shift. Participation remains high, but motivation erodes. Workers stay not because they see a future, but because they fear losing what little stability remains. Job mobility declines. Risk-taking disappears. Innovation slows. When survival becomes the goal, progress stalls. This is how stagnation takes root without a recession headline. The calendar matters here. 2026 is not feared because of a single event, but because of accumulated momentum. Rents locked in at higher levels, insurance premiums scheduled to reset again, student loan burdens reactivated, credit balances compounding at 20% plus interest, public debt approaching $38 trillion with interest costs alone consuming hundreds of billions annually. None of these pressures reverse quickly. They stack. Confidence is the final casualty. Once people stop believing the system will correct itself, they disengage emotionally. Consumption slows, trust erodes, social cohesion weakens. The economy becomes transactional and defensive. People don't dream. They calculate. And even those calculations increasingly fail. This is not about individual weakness. It is about limits. An economy cannot demand endless flexibility from households while offering none in return. It cannot finance basic survival indefinitely. And it cannot expect people to keep striving when every path forward narrows. When enough people reach this stage, the outcome is no longer theoretical. It becomes visible in quiet ways. Fewer purchases, fewer risks, fewer plans, fewer expectations. The system doesn't break all at once. It fades. And when an economy fades instead of grows, the question is no longer how hard people will work. It's how long they can hold on before they let go entirely.